Okay, let's multiply that by another 1,000. So that means you make about, just in spread alone, $9,000 a day. Okay? But in many cases, they're able to deposit that. They can get higher rates on other means. So banks are in the business of making money from the spread. The trouble is, these guys, instead of putting their money into short-term treasury bills, they put most of their money into long-term treasury bonds. Uh, in fall of 2023, I was part of a consulting project that actually created a risk map for Silicon Valley Bank because they had to create a risk model uh, for their own regulators. And one of my specialties is managing the interest rate risk. And we basically said, okay, this is one of your biggest Achilles heel because their business was great. Okay. This bank went from about $5 billion in assets in 2005 to $200 billion in assets by 2022. They were the bank to fund most of the Silicon Valley. And, they made good money from it. But instead of putting them on relatively low interest rate risk environment, they put a lot of money into very long term. And during the first 3 months of, in fact, I don't have to even rely on my memory. We can look. I mean, their bonds were longer than 10 years in maturity, but I'm going to look at only 10 years. Let's look at 5 years. So let's see the end of 2022. Bond yields were around, let's say, 375 or so. By March, uh, they were quite a bit higher. But, a lot of their bonds were purchased when the bond yields were, around here. So let's assume that they were affected by 1 percentage point increase in bonds. All right. All right. No, the wrong file. Let's do a coupon rate of 2.5 originally. And let's assume that it went to 3.5, and which is kind of what happened. And let's make that for 10 years. So your original money, your original investment, assuming it was at par, was about $10,000, but it's now worth only 9,100 and some change, which means you lost about 8.5%, roughly speaking. Now, if you lose 8.5% out of 100 billion, these were not realized losses. Don't get me wrong; these were losses mark to market. In accounting for uh, securities in banks and corporations as well, if you designate a set of assets as to be held to maturity, you don't have to mark them to market for accounting purposes. That means even though, for economically speaking, you're losing money, you're not going to see that in the financial statements. But as a regulator, you have to look at the mark to market numbers. Uh, what was I saying? Okay. If you have $100 billion in these bonds, you lost about 8.5 billion. Okay. Now, even the healthiest banks do not have a capital ratio greater than 12%. Okay. Typically, anything above 8, that calculation is a little bit not that simple, but let's assume the simple case. If you have 12% capital ratio, that means for every $8 of assets, only $1 is yours. The rest are borrowed money. Okay, and that means they have over $200 billion in assets. Their total capital is 1/8 of that, which is going to be about what, 24 billion, right? And you just lost, just from those bonds alone, 8.5 billion. And suddenly your capital adequacy ratio is below 8, just on that alone. And this is assuming nobody actually withdrew their money. But again, this is, I mean, I have bias. I'm a bleeding heart, pinko commie liberal. When Trump became the occupant of the White House, I never ever called him the president. He became the occupant of the White House. The law that they passed basically relaxed some of the restrictions of the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, which created a class of banks that were called banks that are important for the system. Okay, I mean, in 2008, if it wasn't for the federal government, even J.P. Morgan would have went down. Do you know what would have happened if J.P. Morgan had gone down? You would have thought that the Great Depression was a picnic, not the depression of, recession of the 2008. I mean, that would have wiped out a lot of things. And given most of China's assets are in the US, that's going to wipe out China. And that is very fertile environments, for a little war. Okay. So they had to save the system. So they created a system, class of banks. These were called banks that are important to the system. So if one of them goes down, there's a chance that there's contagion. If JP Morgan goes down, there is no way you can save Citi. Okay, there's going to be a rush. Citi's going to go down. Wells Fargo is going to go down. One of the most conservative banks is Wells Fargo. Even they would go down. Bank of America will go down. I'm not even talking about little banks, because nobody cares about the little banks that much, because they're not going to affect the system. And the threshold to be considered a banks important to the system was $50 billion in assets. Under that law, Dodd-Frank, Silicon Valley would have qualified as one of such banks. Now, when you're such bank, there is actually a person or a team of persons from your regulator that is actually physically sitting in your bank. They look at your books every single day. Normally, a bank is examined pretty much quarterly. If your regulator is FDIC, every quarter, every 3 months, they do a bank examination. If there's a risk, they may be taken over. But if you're a bank that is important to the system, somebody is there daily. Okay, they're actually marking the market, everything. But the law passed by the Trump administration increased that limit to $250 billion. That meant Silicon Valley was not such a bank anymore. And it's kind of a combination of the greed of the Silicon Valley Bank executives. They didn't even think that their customers would be taking their money out.